Welcome back to Question Period. We may have taken a brief break this summer, but politics in this country certainly did not. Here's what happened. The Liberals kicked off the summer with a shocking by-election loss to the Conservatives in the riding of Toronto St. Paul's, a riding they had held for 30 years. Then, for weeks, rumors swirled former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney could be set to replace Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland after reports from the Globe and Mail that she was at odds with the Prime Minister's office. Then, just ahead of both the Liberal and NDP caucus retreats, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh announced he had, quote, ripped up his party's agreement to keep the Liberals in power. 2 days later, the Liberal Party's national campaign director, Jeremy Broadhurst, announced he's stepping down at the end of this month. And a few days after that, the party announced Carney would advise the Prime Minister not as Finance Minister, but as chair of what they're calling the Leaders' Task Force on Economic Growth. It all comes to a head Monday when not only does Parliament return, but two big by-elections in Winnipeg and Montreal are set to give us a glimpse into what the fall will hold. Here to dig into all of that is our Sunday strategy session. Kathleen Monk is a former NDP strategist and director of communications to the late Jack Layton. Kory Teneycke was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former director of communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Scott Reid is former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hey guys, good to see everybody. Hope you had a great summer. Hey. Scott, I'm going to start with you. Before we look ahead to what this week and this fall is going to hold, got to get your take on how the summer went for the government and for the opposition in your view.
Well, I mean, for the opposition, if you're talking about the Conservatives, they have to be pretty happy with how the summer went. It started with a big win in Toronto St. Paul. It looks like they could steal a really historic riding for the NDP in Winnipeg-Transcona if that's how next week unfolds. So all thumbs up there. For the Liberals, it was a strange summer. I mean, the traumatic loss of Toronto St. Paul's was met with silence, met with nothing from the Liberals. I mean, literally, they did not make a change of personnel, they did not make a change of policy, they did not make a change of message or direction, and it was carry on and carry forward. The Prime Minister toward the end of the summer seemed to me like he was interacting with a lot of enthusiasm and passion. He's trying to send the signal that he's absolutely up for this scrap with Pierre Poilievre, but the poll numbers aren't budging. That loss in Toronto St. Paul still hangs over the party like a dark cloud, and now there's the specter that they could lose LaSalle Lemar. So it's been a tough summer.
What do you think, Kory, is informing the enthusiasm that Scott is, I think, accurately referencing that we saw at the tail end of the caucus retreat last week, where the Prime Minister's like, I'm ready to fight this fall against Pierre Poilievre. Other than one exception, a Quebec Liberal MP who spoke out against his leadership, nobody else did. They kept telling everybody we're unified, we're ready to get into this. But Scott's also right, nothing new in the window.
Nothing new in the window. I think the other thing that's happened, though, is you're starting to see people fade away. So I don't think you're seeing like a leadership insurrection, but you're seeing people that are just quietly edging their way to the exit and disappearing. So, people like Seamus O'Regan, people like Pablo Rodriguez. These are pretty important people. And if you want to look at a more like grassroots level, a third of people didn't go to their caucus retreat. A third of their MPs. Like, that's weird. That's not something that normally happens. So, it may be brave and bold and maybe loyal to say we're going to all stick together and march off to the election. But the ranks are getting thinner as that march goes on. Like, people are kind of voting with their feet a little bit, is sort of the sense that I get. So, I don't think it's good news.
How was, I guess, help us understand, Kathleen, the strategy with the NDP, the timing of ripping up the deal, as Jagmeet Singh said frequently when they did. And then, even more recently, the sort of, not a new way of talking about the consumer side of the carbon tax, but because Jagmeet Singh made the comments when he did, accusations from the opposition coming from kind of both corners about a lack of a policy position there.
Yeah, so in relation to the confidence supply agreement, I think really since last October in 2023 when the New Democrats had the convention, there's been a lot of reflection on what New Democrats were getting and if they were getting credit for the deal and what else they could kind of eke out of the deal. And when the deal first started in 2022, both staff and political elected folks were really engaged and there were things that were moving, but really the deal had started to peter out. And I think truly Jagmeet Singh and the party decided to rip up the deal when they did because of a number of electoral factors, not just the by-elections where we're hearing on the ground in both ridings that frankly New Democrats needed to separate themselves from the Liberals. We're hearing that in Elmwood, Transcona, also in LaSalle, Verdun, but also the provincial elections that are happening, BC, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, where basically the Liberal Party was a bit of an anvil on New Democrats in those regions. And so they need to make that kind of separation to differentiate themselves, say, no, we're standing up to them. And also, frankly, it's the runway to the next election. So by separating right now, they're unshackled. They're able to kind of be harder, be a true opposition party, fight back on the Liberals, also take on the Conservatives, who frankly are just being obstructionist and focused on basically grinding and stalling out any legislation and getting anything done for Canadians.
So Kathleen referenced the by-elections and how much of a factor those by-elections are. As a proof point for the leadership of both the Prime Minister and Jagmeet Singh, how significant, Scott, in your view, will these by-election outcomes be?
I think they might be more significant in some ways for the Conservatives than they are for anybody else. I mean, if Pierre Poilievre can begin the summer by winning a Liberal stronghold in Toronto St. Paul's and end the summer by winning Bill Blakey's former riding in Winnipeg Transcona, the unmistakable truth is that people have to look at politics and say, my God, this guy is rolling like a locomotive. So that's the true challenge for both the NDP and the Liberals. I mean, Jagmeet Singh can say that the Liberals are an anchor, but he's at 19% and the Liberals are at 21%. I mean, they both feel like they're at the bottom of the seabed. So, and now it's going to be a strange fall session. We are back to a true minority parliament, and minority parliaments are a breeding ground for, risk and delusion, disease and betrayal, and you have to count every vote. It's just madness, and but in all practical considerations, think about it now. The government has to immediately come to grips with how it wants to handle its legislative agenda. So do you bring in a fall economic statement that has measures in order to show change and put something in the window? Well, that would trigger a confidence vote because those would be budgetary measures. Or do you try to slip by without that, just as sort of more traditional, here's an accounting of our finances and move forward? Everything gets harder. Yes, political forces still suggest that it's not in anybody's self-interest to force an election immediately, except for Poilievre. But weird stuff happens in a minority parliament when the government's unpopular, doesn't have a lot of leverage, and emotions run high. That's where we are now.
Do the Conservatives at all, Kory, have to be careful about the degree to which they do push an election or be seen to be forcing an election, given recent polling that shows the majority of Canadians don't really want one at this point?
The majority of Canadians never want an election, right?
Valid.
So I don't think that's really a consideration. Look, the Conservatives will want an election. It's in their interest to have an election. And when you look at right track, wrong direction, like how are people feeling about the government and the country and all of that, there is a overwhelming desire for change. That exists within the electorate, and that's what Poilievre is tapping into. And what does change look like? Well, it requires an election to have that political change occur. So, I think they're doing the exact right thing to be trying to force a vote. And I agree with Scott that the NDP aren't going to be wanting to go to the polls anytime soon. As he said, an anchor is noted as being below the boat, not above. So, the NDP, as long as they're sitting in the teens, I don't think are going to be pushing for an election either. And even if they do decide to become aligned on that, the Bloc is sitting over on the side, putting up their hand and saying, hey, you can do a deal with us too. So, you have to have more than one party that won an election in a minority parliament for there to actually have one occur. And right now we don't have that.
I'm glad Kory brought up the Bloc. Kathleen, last word to you, because there are previous minority governments that stayed in power by leaning on the Bloc, which sort of insulate, and that being the former Harper government. So that
Conservatives,
Conservatives sort of insulates the Liberals if they end up doing the same thing politically, at least to a certain degree. How much do you think they do end up leaning on the Bloc to stay in power?
I think that's just really a process question. I don't think that's what Canadians really care about. Canadians hire politicians every 4 or 5 years to get to work with them in Parliament and the legislature, to actually do the work to make their lives better. And so when Kory says, there's a desire for an election, the desire resides primarily in the Conservative Party leader's office. They would like an election right now because they know that if they triggered one right now, that they would win an overwhelming majority. But you know what Canadians want? They want us to get to work to actually put through legislation that makes their lives better. They actually want the cooperation.
Focuses on making Quebecers
no, but to clear,
better.
They want the cooperation. Well, Canadians live in Quebec too. You know what I mean? So that kind of, as long as the policy.
They also want to separate. It's
Allegedly.
not
I mean, the point is that that kind of cooperation in a Westminster parliamentary system is normal and needs to happen. And in fact, I remember when the Conservatives would support the Liberals, time and time again, vote after vote, or the Conservatives drew on the block for support time and time again. So, it's not always, the nicest arrangements, but I think if we focus on process and not the outcomes for Canadians, it's a problem.
Okay, well, we'll have lots of problems to talk about throughout the next number of weeks. Thanks, guys. Appreciated our Sunday strategy session. Scott, Reid, Kory, Teneycke, and Kathleen Monk.